What are we doing live? We're not ready for this. We're
I
not ready
always
for
get
this.
I always get a giggle at that last clip of your intro video where you like stand up and you're like shiny.
I think
I
I'm
just
I think I'm
makes me
gonna
laugh
always keep that in there. That's mostly for me. It's a good memory. It was actually that story went as there was a startup. I think it was Century, and I was in San Francisco, and Chloe Condon was working there and invited me in to do a little production. We were going to do a funny video for them, and they had this whole room dedicated to, like, it had professional camera, giant green screen, all this stuff, and we created this plot, and it ended up in a video on their website. But we had some great outtakes, and yeah,
That's amazing.
if
Anyways,
you're a, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, there's a little reference in there that isn't, you can't hear the audio, so you don't realize what's happening. But if you're a Firefly fan, the Serenity movie, Firefly is the show. When I'm playing with Moby and Molly, that's actually me acting out the very first scene of the Serenity movie, no, it's the very first scene of it's either the movie or the very first episode where the pilot is playing with dinosaurs, and he's like, "I will eat you." And I was recreating. I actually like read the lines from the show for their little skit thing, and I thought it was so hilarious. We had a film person. Beth was there. I felt like we had like production person, a director of photography. It was so great. Anyway, that's how
Good
that got there.
memories, man.
Yeah.
That's where that genuine smile comes from. I really appreciate that. So what's going on, Brett? What is this? What are we,
Well, you and I were doing we were going to do another show this week. We're still working on our guest list for the year, and then we're going to show that off soon once we actually book some of those guests. But, it's January. We're all playing catch up.
yeah.
The theme is we're behind.
we're we're behind.
Yeah.
It's okay though.
Nirmal admitted he was behind. I'm very behind on my work and life. Like, things aren't getting done.
It's okay. Hopefully us being behind this early on in the year means that we're not behind later.
Yes.
We can put the behind us earlier in the year.
Ooh. And all I need is like 3 weeks where no one sends me any emails, nothing happens on the internet, no news, no CES announcements, no conference announcements. Can we just get a break for like 3 weeks, and then I'll be caught up.
Yes.
Caught up. How about you all out there? Are you all caught up? Caesar's here, DJ's here, Martin's here, the regulars, Anton, Roto, Neal, Alex, what's up? Nirmal's here. Yes, Nirmal is definitely here.
Am I here?
Ansecu's here. Adeleke, sorry if I mispronounced that. Hello. Welcome to the channel. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. So what do we got going? First of all, what is this? Who are you? What's going on in this space?
Yeah, so we have this show. And if you're just stumbling on here because YouTube said, "Hey, you like DevOps or you like Kubernetes or Docker, and this is a live show you should watch," that's because that's what we're about. Like, we're the cloud native DevOps channel that's always talking about things like this little guy, that little guy there,
Yep.
and all of the plushies behind me that you can't actually, like, there's a whole row over here that I could show you, like dozens. And that's what we're about. Not the plushies, but the products behind them.
Yep.
And Nirmal's my co-star. And we are the all-stars. We're trying to be.
There we go.
And we have a show. And this show turns into a podcast. This is live every Thursday. You can be here with us. You can also come check out the podcast. Just look up DevOps and Docker Talk in any podcast player. And you can hear the silky smooth sound of Nirmal's voice in high def stereo sound.
Yep.
We also have a giant Discord server. I say giant because we're thousands and thousands of people now. I can say we're in the tens, the 10 of thousands.
Is it really? What's like? Is there a count somewhere?
Yeah, there's a count. there's now a new thing where I think everyone can go and look. Actually, there's members. You can go to members here. Does it give a count?
Yes.
17,362.
Whew. That is a
That's a
lot of
good amount of
people.
people.
Yeah.
That's a good amount of people.
Join us on there. Ask questions.
That
Answer
link right there.
questions. Help
That link
people
right there.
out. Have awesome conversations. Tell us what's going on. Oh yeah, we exactly dozens. There's dozens of us.
There's so many
Oh
dozens.
yes.
The dozens of cloud native. I mean, these are the Swarm fans. These are the Kubernetes fans. These are the cloud container people that just want to containerize the world. That's what we're doing over here. And so we also got that. I have a newsletter, so you can find out who's going to be on this show besides Nirmal. You can find out what we're releasing. I mean, every week we release a newsletter, a live stream, a podcast. Like, there's just tons of stuff happening. And then there's even more than that. So you can kind of go back in the archives. That's at Bret.news, or just find links below. So you can find out what's going to be on this show. There's actually calendar invites in there so you don't miss. The whole point in this being live is so Nirmal and I can take your questions, give them to our guests. We're talking with Phil, our buddy Phil at AWS, to be on the show and talk about Finch. For those of you that are interested in Docker desktop alternatives like Colima and now Finch, and we've got Nerd Control. We've got all these neat little tools made by the container community. And we're going to have him on to talk about it.
Yep.
Soon.
It's in the works. And shout out to Phil if you're listening.
If he's hanging out, we appreciate you. We're looking forward to another show. I think he's actually the only one. I don't think because you don't show up at my house. I think that Phil's the only one that's been here live in the studio ever out of 250 episodes, by the way.
You should. Is this the 250?
This is 250, buddy. 250.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Can we give a round of applause to Bret for getting to 250 episodes? That's a massive achievement. So congratulations, Bret. That's it's awesome. I know, both being on in front of the camera, being a guest over the years, and now co-hosting with you, I know it's a lot of work for you and your team and Beth. So congratulations. That's a big milestone.
And now you volunteered to be a part of that.
Yes.
So you're welcome.
What have I done?
I know. What have you done yourself?
Yeah. So you should definitely check out all the 250 episodes, or 249 that are out there. We've covered a lot of topics already in the last, 6 months now together as me being co-host, but there's tons of great content about lots of different tools, software, CNCF projects, Docker captains. I mean, just everything. All the milestones are on there. So check out on YouTube those previous videos. And
look how young I looked back then.
I know.
That's all I can think about is how young I look. And the first 15 episodes are actually hidden on the internet. They're in YouTube. They're just not in this channel. So the first 15 were on a personal channel, not the brand channel as this now is. And back then YouTube didn't let you move videos between channels. So those are hidden. You can't even, you could find them if you searched. If you're good at searching, you could probably find one and post a link. But
we should
live from DockerCon 2018. Were you with me in 2018 live?
Yes, somewhere in there. Yes, because it was the popsicles. It was the popsicle stick in the pen. I'm somewhere in there.
I mean, all these people, since then, they've all gotten married. They've had kids. They've moved to different countries.
Yes.
Life has happened during this show. If there's one thing I'm proud of on this show, besides scoring you as an amazing co-host, it's the fact that we're still here.
Yeah.
Right? We're still here 5+ years later.
I will keep saying this, but the Docker Captain program was life-changing for me. Meeting you, Bret, and Phil, and Laura, everyone,
Yeah. Yeah.
Antonis, like the list goes on. We, from around the world, we bonded over really cool stuff, and just gelled really nicely together as like a,
Yeah.
it, essentially a team of random people, a group of random people from around the world, and yeah, like we're in each other's lives, and I hope to continue to be not only in your life, Brett, for the foreseeable future, but also like the other Docker captains and the community, the folks that are listening to the show right now, like the
You
regulars
people.
that show up. You know, uh, thank you for being on this journey with us, and being there, and supporting us, and asking awesome questions, providing awesome comments, and keeping the conversation going. That's what we're here for.
Yeah. I know. People keep showing up. I'm not sure why, but maybe y'all can tell us. James actually has a question. And this is why we're here. We're here for the questions, but we do have some Dockerfile stuff we're going to get to. Uh, First question: is there a place where I can store Docker images for free? Yes, Docker Hub,
Yep.
or Quay, or Key, depending on how you want to pronounce that. I think the official way is
Um,
actually Quay. Even though the word itself is actually properly pronounced Key. Um, I've been so confused over the years. Uh, and then also GitHub Actions. I mean, GitHub has a container registry I mean,
mhm,
it's not just for GitHub Actions. I say GitHub Actions, but GitHub has a great one. I
mhm.
love that one. In fact, I put all of mine, both personal and private, on GitHub and Docker Hub. So
There you
if
go.
I go
There's
over
lots of
to,
options.
yeah,
There's lots of options.
I mean that's those are the two for me. A lot of enterprises, if they're going to use something free, or more Red Hatty or businessy people, that they use Quay. If you look at mine under packages here on GitHub, you can actually see. I don't think they have. Yeah. Okay. So type a container image. You can still see these are all free. This is all free. I didn't pay for any of this. It's open source.
Hmm.
I know Docker Hub gives you like I think 3 repositories privately for free, but you have a sort of unlimited free open source storage there.
Yeah. And
And
also,
yeah, and these
I'd be remiss to say that AWS ECR also has a free tier.
and a
Um,
public product as well as the private one.
yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, there's lots of options actually. now, now that we're mentioning them, there's probably a half dozen options. So,
Hmm.
oh,
Is
is
it
it,
Quay.io?
James? Did you mean where to run the image, like a hosting provider? Just let us know in the chat.
Oh, to run Docker images. Um, ECS type service where I can host my website. That's a Docker image. So
Yeah. So
AWS um, App
there's
Runner.
App Runner. Yep. I was just pulling that up. There's a App Runner pricing is right here.
Yeah, it's what is the
There's
yeah? I
that.
was gonna say what's the cheapest?
It's hard to say a definitive answer because it can depend on the traffic and like what you're doing. um, if you're like hosting like a LLM that's like doing like GPU based like request processing, going to be pretty hard to do that for less than $10 a month. uh, so it kind of just always depends on what you're trying to do. But yeah, there's different options out there for all different kinds of tiers. There's DigitalOcean, there's App
Yeah,
Runner, there's free tiers. So
there's. I was trying to think. I'm pretty sure. I thought. Yeah, like you can get a server, a very tiny server on DigitalOcean for $4 a month, and it's really dependent on your apps, right? If you're just
yeah,
going to run a static site on Nginx with a bunch of static files, That's
Yep.
easy. The smallest server will do.
Yep.
Uh, and like you can use Graviton instances. I don't know if is Graviton supported in App Runner. I actually don't know. So Graviton v3.
Trying to look at the.
Yeah, I need to go over to the calculator. So Graviton instances, which are ARM, if you can build your images in ARM, I find those to be paying for what you get. You get way more than Intel in the cases I use it. You get more for your money, essentially. So
So I don't believe it's supported yet, but there is an open. There's an open issue on the roadmap for Graviton support on App Runner currently. So,
where's the one
but
that used to?
that's a good idea.
What's the cost calculator that I've always used and I cannot remember it while we're live?
It's
It's like EC2 info or something.
it's calculator.aws.
Oh, that's not the one I was thinking of. But is this official? Is
Okay,
this official one?
yeah, that's the official one.
Oh, okay. Oh, create estimate. See, that's already more work than I want to do. EC2.
Uh, James, you're also more than welcome to ping us on the Discord um, to dig into the details of that question, because that's a really good question.
Oh man, why is this not listed? It's like, is it gone? It's like AWS info something. I'm struggling. I'm on the struggle bus. Somebody in Shirley in chat's going to tell me what this is.
So
Anyway, so what?
before you can run your Docker image, you need a. Before you run your Docker image, Brett, you need a.
Dockerfile.
There it is.
All right, you're looking for the segue.
Yes.
Neil, so we're not going to talk about readiness probes versus health checks. Health check is a term that Docker uses. I guess the short answer there is that Docker calls it a health check because it only has one type. Kubernetes doesn't technically call it a health check. Like there's types of probes. Readiness probe is one of them, right?
Yep.
So these are just commands, really, in a lot of cases. Kubernetes actually has the ability to ping specific protocols, which is actually cute and neat because it saves you the burden of having to actually execute a command or have a curl line. So I always look for those things like pinging an HTTP URL. But if your app isn't web-based, you've got to do something else. So you can look up Dockerfile health check commands, which is specifically for Docker and Swarm. It will not affect Kubernetes. Kubernetes, you have to put it in YAML. It's called a probe, and there are 3 at least different types of probes. And if you want a pod spec that shows examples, I'm going to just link this to you, and then you can go check it out. And then we're going to get back to Docker files. Okay, so Docker files. Let's talk about Docker files. Thanks for the layup, buddy.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, so I'm giving you all a link to a. We're going to shift over here. This is the color of my Dockerfile tabs. All right, so over here. Hey, did you know I had a newsletter? We mentioned newsletters earlier.
Yep.
In this newsletter, number 36, I talked about front ends. So I'm not going to read this to you, but the podcast also has me reading it like a bedtime story. I read this nice little article. You can go to sleep to it, and it's just me talking. But the whole point here is you all have been using Dockerfile features that are technically a part of new versions of the Dockerfile standard that you probably aren't versioning correctly, so that you can guarantee that every instance you might build your image on, every server or CI or Docker version that might build it, can always build it. And a lot of people don't realize that the things they're using in their Dockerfile aren't actually a standard across the industry, may not work if you're not using buildkit, and that may not work if you're using old versions of buildkit. Well, there's ways to help with that, and we're going to solve those problems today.
How? But before we go all the way into that, I didn't know that there was multiple versions of Docker files. It kind of makes sense, right? Because It's something that there's new command, new uh, commands or items that are added over time to the
Yeah.
build to the Dockerfile and new functionality. So where can I find what the latest, what's going on with Dockerfile versions? And
Yeah, like that's a good question because we didn't. So OCI, we've all heard the OCI
right,
specifications, right? Like that's thrown out there a lot, like OCI standard images,
right,
OCI runtimes in Kubernetes, OCI registries, something called distribution. Those are
hmm
the three standards, and I talk about that a lot, especially in my courses and like Docker 101s, is that the industry is all governed by these three standards: the way a container runs, the image format that is storing the data and its metadata, and then the way we move it around the internet. But what's
yep,
not in there is how you build that OCI image standard. Like,
interesting,
yeah,
interesting.
you can
So
make it by hand. You could actually literally copy files, make a JSON file, tar it up. You could do this all with shell commands. You don't even need a builder, an image builder, because it's really just tarballs with files and directories.
that sounds somewhat painful to do,
I
but
would
you
never
could do
do
it.
it. I would never do it.
Interesting,
but
interesting.
but yeah, I mean the Docker build command was really just, back, if we think back to a decade ago, the Docker build command was really just automating what people were already doing for
Right.
decades in other things like Solaris zones and jails and chroot and all these different utilities for taking an isolated file system and only showing you what you think is on the system, when in reality you're just in a little, what we call jails, way back in the day.
Or zones.
um old BSD or zones. I liked jails. I always thought jails sounded like, I don't want to be in a jail. I want to run the whole system. So when you rent servers on the internet 20 years ago, you were often not really renting the whole thing, especially if you're paying like, $10 a month. You were paying for a little slice. We didn't have containers, so they had to make up, different OSs had different terms for this idea of limiting you to a certain part of the operating system. Anyway,
Yep.
so when we started with Docker, the Docker build was really just this simple little thing. But over time, the builder got more complicated, and Docker decided to rethink the whole thing. And that's when buildkit happened. And we all heard about buildkit. I think you probably were there. 2017, we were in Austin, and at the Moby Summit, which was like a pre-conf to the Docker conf, it was all about the open source of Docker. The team kind of got up and said, we
Mm.
got this thing. We've been working on it privately, or it's actually open source, but we haven't really told anybody. And we call it BuildKit, and it's going to do all these things. And we hear about a lot of these things. We hear about it's faster, it's more efficient. It'll actually skip things it doesn't think it needs to do. It'll do things in parallel. It'll
Right.
build. You can build multiple different architectures at the same time in parallel. It does all
Yep.
these wonderful things, and it's used in tons of tools in the industry now. Dozens of tools have it as sort of a library. But one of those things was the idea that the builder doesn't need to know how to read a Docker file. The doc
Interesting. So those
the
are separate.
recipe,
Those are like
yeah,
the recipe from the out the recipe from the food were separate things
yeah,
essentially.
yeah. Like it turns out that BuildKit and the foundations of it aren't even Dockerfile specific. It can build anything. You could actually use it to parse make files or other things if you wanted to. And so it's like a decision tree and a building engine or execution engine all in one. And one of their ideas, which was a real problem. I mean, you and I, especially in those early days of Docker, right? Docker version 1.10, 1.11, like, and then they changed to these date versions, and there were 17.03, and what was happening was they were enhancing Docker rapidly, but
hmm
especially those of us that operated servers, we weren't updating all the time. Like maybe on your local machine, you're updating Docker all the time, but servers don't get that update every single month or quarter. And that meant that if you wrote a new Docker file that had the newest features, and then when your CI went to build it, your Jenkins, because this was old days, right? So we were still using Jenkins, and
Still,
you
people
built it.
use
It would
Jenkins. It's
some
okay
some
if you're
people
still
still
using Jenkins.
some people still use it. But if they have an old Docker version, then that
Yes.
Docker build would fail, or you'd get some weird error that wasn't obvious that it was
Interesting.
you
Yeah.
using a new feature in an old builder.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there wasn't any version, like we couldn't say, like in compose files back in the day, we couldn't say version colon something in a Docker file. So we
Right.
couldn't clarify. We just had to hope whatever we built on was the latest version of Docker. Well,
Yep.
BuildKit took that and it split out the parser for Dockerfile as a separate thing. And in fact, we can now see those, and you might as well call it Dockerfile versions. I'm kind of making that up, like Dockerfile versions.
I
Like, I
mean,
mean,
yes, that's what it is.
yeah, they have this page. I mean, it says Dockerfile release notes version 1.6. Like, that seems like versions to me.
Yes.
But no one talks about Dockerfile versions. I've not actually ever heard someone say in a talk or in a demo that I'm using Dockerfile version 1.2. Like, no one ever says
Yes.
that,
Right.
but it's there, and we
So
can
where
go back.
what page? So what page is this? Where are we at?
Yeah, we can search for Dockerfile release notes. This is on Docker's website under build Dockerfile release notes, and I'll put it in chat so people can go reference this. So now that you know there's versions, the next question people usually ask is, oh, what new features are there and how do
Yeah.
I use them? And this has nothing to do with Docker versions, by the way.
So what new features are there, and how do I use them, Brett?
Let's lean in. So now that we've established that BuildKit is the way we should be building, a lot of the tools in the industry use it. Even non-Docker tools will pull in the open source BuildKit as their execution engine, and they might have a container file, they might have something else, different file types, different names. I think Builda is one of the tools that does not use BuildKit. There's a few others, but when you go look at some of these unique tools, especially in different languages or frameworks, you'll find that underneath they're really just wrapping their automations and assumptions for their languages on top of a BuildKit library, which is great because BuildKit's awesome and that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to be this universal builder. So if we know that it doesn't have a hard-coded Dockerfile parser in it, then how does this even work when none of us have been specifying Docker versions? Well, the way it works, I'll tell you. You want to know? I'll tell you how it works. Is that every version of BuildKit that ships comes with the latest version of the Dockerfile parser at the time of its release.
That's not the best way of specifying.
Yeah. And we in this cloud native world, we love to specify versions. We're all about hard coding versions.
Yeah. It's especially if you're in the Kubernetes world, that's like the main line of every spec YAML.
Dependencies matter.
Yes.
Dependency versions matter. So if today you're on Docker Engine, let's say a year ago, they released, I think, version 23. And they released that of Docker Engine a year ago. That also had packaged with it, for your convenience and mine, BuildKit. BuildKit has its own version. And then in that BuildKit version, there is a version of the front-end parser that was just the latest at that time. So it's kind of tricky to even figure out what version of this Dockerfile release notes your particular Docker version can build. In fact, if I do a Docker info, I'm actually just curious. I don't even know. We go over here. If I look for, let me just search for BuildKit. Yeah, see, it's not even in there. There's something called BuildX, which is not directly BuildKit. It's the implementation of BuildKit's library inside of the Docker CLI. So that's not the same thing. Like if we're up here looking, we can see like versions of things, and there's BuildX, but that's not the Docker. That's not the BuildKit front end version.
Right.
Okay. So I feel like you all get with like there's a problem here, and we've all largely been ignoring it because if you're using the cloud to build, like GitHub Actions, Docker Hub, whatever your execution environment is, GitLab runners, if you're using someone else's runners, it's their job to keep Docker Engine updated, so you're hopefully fine. Like you've been building so far, you're working. But if the version 1.6 releases, which was released 6 months ago, and they have experimental features, so we're expecting at some point this year a new release, a 1.7 maybe. But if I saw this and I thought, ooh, wow, cool, this is a neat feature. The add instruction can now import files directly from Git URLs, which basically means I can Git clone without needing Git installed in my Dockerfile. That's amazing. I want to use that always. How do I do it? Well, we can go learn. We'll learn in a minute how to put that in a Dockerfile. But then how can I guarantee that it's always going to build? And that's the rub. That's where we get the front end syntax, which is this file. I'll be putting all these links into Slack. Yeah, so there's this little line, and this is the one that I use. It's kind of hard to see. It's a little small.
So to the folks watching us right now, have y'all ever seen this line in a Dockerfile?
It should be in every Dockerfile now, assuming you're using buildkit. But
which is, that was some of the announcements at DockerCon, which is like making buildkit and all that stuff more of the default way of building Docker images now. So I'd be curious to know from our audience whether they've ever even seen this line. Okay. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So I personally, very rarely have I even seen this line in a Dockerfile, but
yeah, because I don't even think Docker themselves is really good in demos and in their own talks, because things tend to work especially in our local machine. Now that Docker Desktop's auto updating, like I'm getting the latest version of this stuff usually, and it's not going on a rapid clip, right? They're doing one, maybe two updates a year to this, so it's not so rapid. But there is a chance that the new features will come out. You'll be excited. You'll put it in. It'll build on your machine. Then you'll commit it to your repo. It gets built in your CI, and then it fails because your CI is 3 months old in Docker, and this was in the latest Docker release from last month or whatever. So there's totally a way that this could go bad. And the challenge is that it's not the way that it fails when you're out of date isn't always the same way, and it's not always clear that it's kind of like putting a line in a programming language of an old version and it doesn't know what that function is or function call is. It's going to error in weird ways. And this is a problem. So I experience this usually when I'm working with companies that run their own CI, and their CI updates are either infrequent or their engineers are always trying to use the latest features, right? One of the two. Right. And then there's and then there's
likely
a problem.
Both. Likely both.
Yes, or both. And so the lesson today, if there's one thing everyone should take away, is that you should always have this little line. And if I paste it in the chat, I don't even know what it'll look like in chat. Like it might be ugly. But you should put that line at the first line of every Docker file. And we can even look at, I'm going to show a couple of examples here. But here's an example. This is the first line right here. Now, you don't have to specify a minor version. This is Simver. So I prefer in all of my files to do a :1. And that ensures, assuming that, and they are trying to follow strict Simver rules of no breaking changes in version 1.
Right.
So you should feel pretty safe. But just having this line, even if you don't have any of these fancy features in your file, putting this line in your file ensures that the first thing BuildKit does before it tries to parse your file is it goes to Docker Hub and tries to find the latest version 1 of the Dockerfile front end parser. And
interesting.
We didn't need to know this, but this is over on Docker Hub. We can actually go and look. Okay, go ahead and talk.
Yeah, no worries. So I was just going to ask you what that does, putting that line there, but you're going into it. So
yeah,
this is like so hidden. Like we've been doing this kind of stuff for 10 years now, roughly, right? Plus or minus. We've never really even talked about any of this.
There's a I mean, just like that there's layers to the technologies in the world that we all use, like people nerd out on certain technologies. And
yes.
I mean, the name of this channel still has Docker in it. So I feel like I should be nerding out on Docker. And
no, this is good.
This is one of those things.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. You're teaching me something new here. Brett,
I'm excited. You
Yeah,
teach me something new, so I'm just returning the favor.
there we go.
Um, and this is a Dockerfile front end. This is literally what Docker build is doing in the background every time you specify that syntax line, and you can see
So
these
this is
versions here.
this is
Like,
the parser. This
yeah,
is the parser that the build kit pulls
yeah,
at run
Docker slash
at build time.
Dockerfile. And it even has a Docker file upstream, so it even has this, like, they're even nested. So like, uh, there's a release cycle. So there's ways for you to test these things in something called labs. There's ways for you to test this in pre-release, which is that's what this is. This is the staging versions. So
Right.
Docker is very careful to make sure that they have all these different ways for people to test. And generally, this is for people that are really paying attention to build kit releases. And by the time that us normal people even have heard, I would say normal, but like even just most captains, by the time we found out about it, all this has happened. It's been officially released, and it's listed in your Docker desktop new features if it's some major new feature. Like
Right.
we
Right.
added the dash SSH mount feature, which came in years ago, and it was allowing people to put their SSH keys from their agent or a key file into a build without it being stored in the build. That's
Yeah.
probably the most common feature coming out of the Dockerfile front ends that I see people using every day, but they still don't understand that this is a very specific version of the Dockerfile, and you need to make sure that syntax line is in there. Otherwise, if you're using a 3-year-old version of Docker, it won't build, or a 4-year-old version or whatever.
So right now there's some Docker engineers that are super happy that we've highlighted their work.
There's a lot of work going on here.
Yes.
And this, I mean, basically what Docker is doing now is that this is how new features in the Dockerfile make it into the Dockerfile. We have something called the compose spec, which
which is
relatively new.
Yeah, relatively new, but also like where we probably have seen versions of something
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of things that we've been doing, right? But that's totally different, right? Like a compose version's different.
Yeah. Yeah. DJ is saying the front end word is such a strong meaning elsewhere already. I wonder if they didn't choose something like image definition. Well, so think of how this is how it makes sense to me, is that there's the builder that builds Docker images.
Okay.
And the very front end of that we users would see is the Docker files parsing definition. And that's the most front end of the build engine, is what the user sees. And we're all the users at this point of a Docker file. And so if we decided to have BuildKit, if we went and wrote a custom BuildKit front end for make files or Ruby or package.json files, that would be the most front end thing that we would all see, right?
So BuildKit has an API to build images, and these are translators from some human readable format into the API that BuildKit uses to build images.
And in this case, because BuildKit is really a daemon running in the background, it is the API. If you were to think of a web app with the front end and the API backend, BuildKit's daemon is the API backend, and the front end parser is what we all see when we're writing in a file, and we're writing Docker build or whatever when we run from the command line.
To kind of stress the analogy that I believe Allah is mentioned, is it like the K8's API version? Kind of, but it's almost more like the version of kubectl in a weird way.
Yes.
Right?
Because the API version is the BuildKit version, and we can go over and look at BuildKit, and we all just kind of, I think, thought that BuildKit.
This was just BuildKit doing its thing.
This was just BuildKit, yeah. And so BuildKit is its own repo, and it is the API. It is the daemon running in the background whenever you type Docker build or Docker buildx build, or Docker compose build or anything that uses the BuildKit engine. But in here there are front ends, and you can there's even a directory for it. And so we have Dockerfile, but there's other ones. And we won't even get into other ones today. We're not even going to go down that rabbit hole. But the Dockerfile, because that's the name of the show, is the Dockerfile. So we're just
and that's what we're most used to.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Okay, so now that we have that base premise, and we know if we go back to our file that you need that syntax line. Now, again, I only recommend you just put in the one. I don't think you really need to specify the dot something version. I have not seen any ill effects of using just one. Docker themselves advises, you basically have Dockerfile -1. But you can notice even my Copilot, my GitHub Copilot, is showing me these other things. And we could talk about labs and experimental, and that's basically how new features slowly work their way into this, is through that. But what I wanted to do was I'll give you 3 different examples. These are ones I mentioned in the blog post, and I talk a little bit about in the podcast. But I'll give you maybe 3 common examples, and then this is stuff that I don't know when it's going to release, but I'm planning on this being in the Udemy Docker Mastery course. So these are actually things I'm adding into the source code for that course, and then at some point I'll make videos about it. And maybe we'll just use this video for now as a point of reference so people can come and look at it. So let's just go through a couple examples. You think we're ready for examples? You think this is a good time?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get into it. I want to see more stuff with this.
Yeah. So this is a pretty simple one. It's a little it doesn't have a huge benefit if you're not someone with really complicated Docker files. But this one's known as the here docs feature. And so by the way, I'm doing this is I'm really just going through the Dockerfile release notes version by version. And I could literally go and give examples for every single one of these features, but we'd end up with dozens and dozens. So what I'm doing is I'm doing the heavy hitters, the ones that that are very front end to us, that we actually change our commands in a Docker file. And so that's how we get to this one. So this one, I need a longer, more complicated example, but this is what we all used to do. When we need a long, complicated run command that maybe does an apt-get update, then an apt-get install, and then technically this would need to have something else, it would need to do an apt cache clean, or what I think the more official way to do it is you just literally delete a directory. So we've all learned over the last decade that we need to do all this in a single run line because that's a single layer, and we need the layer to clean up after itself and do everything it needs to all in one layer. And there's never really been a way for us to chain, which this isn't a feature yet, but I'm going to imagine a new feature. In the future, imagine if we could chain 3 run commands all into a single layer and it was nice and clean. Well, we don't have that. So this is an alternative. So if you look down here at this is the new way. So this is using the here docs format. And if we just jump over.
Yep.
So yeah,
yeah,
someone in there, here docs. Here docs support. So let's just jump over to the here docs site. Oh, are they not gonna? Here documents. Here document. Come on. You can do it. Okay. I was hoping for something a little bit better looking than this, but here docs is a standard. It's not, Docker did not invent this. They simply adopted what you might consider a cleaner way to have long shell scripts. Essentially, that's what these are, right? You're chaining commands. Yep. Long shell scripts in a Docker file that are easier to read. So that's why I think I need a better example of this, because this isn't that compelling. But if I was to have a 30-line, like if you go and look at the MySQL definition,
it's like massive
for their Docker file, it's got this huge amount of script, and it's escaping, it's doing all this weird stuff. It's chaining. There's these 3 different things you have to do in every command. You have to have the double ampersand, which means only if this one is successful, then do the next command. I don't know if people knew that about shells, but if you did a 2 semicolons, that means run the next command anyway, regardless of the success of this command. But if you do 2 ampersands, you're saying, no. If the first command doesn't work, don't do the second. So down here, I don't have to do that. I actually can just type normal commands like I'm in a shell script. And all I need really in this case is this little end of file front parse part where I'm piping it in, and then I have to put the EOF at the end. So some people that have learned how to escape like shell scripts inside of shell scripts, or commands inside of SSH commands inside of a shell script, like if people are used to the shell, they're probably used to this. And this seems
so. Is there an implicit ampersand backslash in the new way? So on line 12, because you did line 11 that way, on line 12, you didn't have to write ampersand slash, but is it implicit there?
Right. This is basically the format as if you were to write a shell script. because you don't have to do that in a shell script, right? Each new line, it considers you hit the enter key, you typed in a new command, you hit the enter key. So that's what it's doing here for you, which we kind of all wish this is how it just worked by default anyway.
I
But
guess
it's not.
would if line 13 failed, would line 14 run?
No.
Oh, got it. So
Right.
there is an implicit and there.
Right, that's true. Of any, like, it would be exactly if you were to write a shell script file, like a .sh file. So if I'm in a .sh file and the first command doesn't work, it's going to stop. It's going to error out. And you can even change that at the top of a shell script and do different things there. But
so we might need to just double check on that. DJ is mentioning that, the here doc standard, it depends on what here doc.
So we can control it. Just like in a normal shell script, we can control it.
Yeah, so we'll have to double check that. But either way, this is like a new version. Like, this is something new that's in the Dockerfile spec front end.
Yep.
Spec version, whatever we're calling it.
One.
Dockerfile version.
Oh, well, I did an apt-get update, so it's going to take a second. I was just going to test that.
You should have run a command that will fail, right?
No, it's supposed to run. So yeah, look like could I be wrong? Right, I'm putting in a bad command there. Of course, it's going to. I need to parse it out as without the fancy interface because we can't see the logs when it's successful. But yeah, look at that. I might be wrong. That's why we do this live, so that I'm wrong on the internet forever. That might mean that it's a double semicolon.
Great questions, DJ.
DJ, no, that's why we have people here to call me on my ignorance.
Yeah, so that might be a good topic for another Q&A show in the future, is going into that, because this is everywhere in Docker files, like
right
everywhere. So we should probably cover that. Let us know in the chat if that we should dig into the here docs format.
Yeah, and to be fair, this is one of those that I never use because, and that's clear. You can tell because I don't even know how it works. I never use when I'm consulting because it's so rare to see it. It's only a couple years old, but because it's 1.4, and we can go back and look at the version 1.4 when it was released. But it's only like, let's say it's 3 years old, and everyone's Docker files are based on so many examples and the official images. And all the official images try to skip a lot of these new advanced features in case you're maybe trying to build those official images or you're using those for non-Docker BuildKit builders, like you're using Builda or other builders that may not have that. A great example, by the way, of how this is all starting to expose itself in the industry as a potential problem for future compatibility is if you're a fan of Builda, the Red Hat image builder that does not use BuildKit. For example, over on their repo, there is a year, 2 years, well, a year and a half, maybe approximately, request to add the -- link, which we're going to talk about that example next. But the copy -- link feature, which is in BuildKit's front end version, I think it's 1.4.
It's
which is
1.4, yeah, which is on March 22.
Yeah, so if you tried to use -- link in BuildKit or any recent version of Docker, it's going to work. It's going to be fine. But if you try to use it with Builda, it won't work because their definition of a Dockerfile, and this is what I find frustrating in the industry, is since we don't really have an official standard, it's not like I can go to dockerfile.info or whatever and see versions of the official standard and that all building tools say, we adhere to the Dockerfile standard version, blah, blah, blah. Like, no one's really doing that. And I do find that a little frustrating because what they're all doing is cherry picking features that Docker has implemented in the build file, or the Dockerfile rather, and they like that feature. So then they add it to theirs, but they don't reference it as like, we support everything in Dockerfiles up to version 1.2, right? They don't really do it like that, which I feel like if we had an official spec, that than they would, right? Um, it's a little confusing. So
Yeah,
buyer
I
beware.
mean, I'm I think this is kind of like hidden in a lot of places, because you were kind of saying that the errors that come out of these discrepancies show up in weird ways, and maybe like your CI tools, or if you're switching like different build platforms, or so versus like what you have on your desktop, or laptop or something that you're using to build Docker images locally. So I wonder if there's a subset of folks that have hit issues building Docker images in various ways and didn't realize that this is actually why.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point you make. And let me just show you what it looks like. So here's 1.4, right? This is the here doc thing we were doing.
Right.
So we know this actually built, even though I don't know, it's clear that command is failing, and at least I hope it's failing. I don't know what it would be running. And it's still finishing, right? It's still completing successfully. But if I actually change this version to an old version, this is going to be fun, because if I just go back one version to 1.3, the previous release, and I rebuild, let me clear it out so people can.
So in theory, this should fit. Yep.
So
unknown
instruction.
Yeah, that's not.
So it's not telling you the front end version is wrong, or you need to update.
And I know I've hit this where if I read that
failed
error
to solve
right now,
yeah.
If I read that error, I would have thought, my first instinct would have been, oh, did I pick the right from image? Am I using like a CentOS base image or something like that?
Yeah, is apt-get not a proper shell command? Right.
Yeah, like that's what I would think. And I would have spent hours trying to figure out why apt-get it doesn't work.
Because it says unknown instruction, which is a little bit similar to binary not found, or whatever the typical Linux
or just that, or that tool's not there.
Command
like,
not
it could
found.
Have been, if you had put curl there, it would have said unknown instruction, curl not found, and then you would have put an instruction to install curl.
Command. Yep.
And that command would have been like, oh, curl's installed.
It's already here. Yeah.
Like that would have been really frustrating.
So what's interesting?
There's a whole category of issues.
Yeah, this is like let's just do 1.0, right? Like if I go way back to the very first version where they sort of announced that front ends were a thing, let's see if the error changes, because this is.
It does change. It's a little bit different.
Line. Error failed to create LLB definition, Dockerfile parse error line 12, unknown instruction. So funny, if I go way back, it actually is a little bit clearer. And see, this is the thing, is that it's downloading the parser, and who knows what the parser looks like? I don't even know I haven't looked at that code. But it's each version of the parser is going to. So here's the thing. This is random, right? Like we're down a rabbit hole here. Let me jump forward to a different example, because I know we're running out of time. But if we go to this one, so this is we were doing the here docs. I'm going to close that one. I'm going to go to my next example of this one is the dash link. So this one actually is a little confusing. So this adds a new option to the copy command down here. We'll get into what it is in a second. But it came with 1.4, and if I jump into that directory link, I think, yeah. So if I'm in that directory and I do a Docker build again,
yep,
this should work. So it builds fine because it's supposed to. But if I change that to version 1.3, which doesn't have the dash link,
yep.
Let's do that again. I get this weird error. Unknown flag link. So that's actually a little bit closer to a good error, right?
Still not the best, but yes, at least the words parse and the words link and flag are there, which gives you a hint to where the issue is. But
now I should say,
but it doesn't allude to what the resolution is.
Yeah, so I will say real quick, let's go to the Docker desktop UI real quick. Oh, this is going to be a little ugly. That's not what I was hoping for. Current application? No. That's not the current application that I wanted. It seems that the Docker desktop UI cannot be correctly shown. Wait, let me try this. Let me try one more time. Sorry, we're getting a little
tiny. It's so tiny.
I'm going to do monitor, primary, tertiary display. No.
So while Brett's figuring out his screen share, let us know in the chat if you've hit this kind of issue before or some of these kind of errors. I know I have, especially around unknown commands, and I did not know that this was a potential reason why.
Yeah, this is super. Yeah, like how many people have struggled with it, and their resolution was probably just to, oh, I'm on an old CI node, let me update Docker, and then it fixes, and they blame it on the Docker engine version, which actually is, you don't need to do that anymore. That's the wonders of this, is that as long as that syntax line is in your Dockerfile, you don't need to do this. But I should shout out to Docker. They have this new build interface. It's pretty new. It's like less than a couple months old. And it shows the results and the errors of each build, which we didn't have before. And when you're in the GUI that I was just showing a while ago, I'm sorry, when I was in the command line, it actually says, go click this link. It'll take you to the dashboard, show you the details. And it'll say an error occurred during the build. Look at error logs and Dockerfile parser, error line, unknown flag. Like this is actually pretty slick.
Yes,
this is pretty slick.
It's a lot better.
And we should probably have a whole episode on just sort of debugging builds, but this is exactly what it's for. I can see errors, I can see the logs, breaking it down. This kind of reminds me of like a CI's logs. Yeah. I mean, just like what? I don't know what that's showing me, but there's a lot. Like you all should go check it out. It's the builds interface over in the left menu, builds. Anyway, I digress. That's a distraction. Let's get back to the examples.
Cool. Let us know in the chat if you'd like a show on builds.
Yeah. Yeah. So bottom line, versions matter. And you should specify :1 here, right? So let's go back to 4.
So
I want to show this one last example, because in this one, actually, well, we'll get to this one in a second. I should have asked you if you had a hard stop at 2. We're going to go a few minutes extra if you're okay.
It's all good. I've got a few minutes.
Okay. So this -- link is another one that is actually, it's a major feature. It's in the front end, so we have to actually change the command down here on line 19. But I still find it mentally confused. Like I am confused by when it should be used and when it shouldn't, and the effects of it. So essentially, the -- link takes a copy or an add line, and it removes it from the order of execution in a Docker file, and it runs it in parallel independently. So it copies these files into its own layer, but normally anything in a Docker file is based on the lines before it. So if I were to run this line up here, or I took out the -- link, it would apply it after this run command. And so the results of that run command would be in the file system, and technically in the background when we're all building images, there's technically for each layer that has to execute something like a run or a command or an add or a copy or add. Those commands, it technically is starting a little container, applying the changes, because it doesn't know what an apt or APK add does. It doesn't know what that's going to do. So it has to actually create a new container at that point in time, run the command that's in the run line, and then save it or commit it essentially to a new layer. Well, in this one, what we're saying is this layer doesn't have anything to do with any other layer. It doesn't even matter. It's just going to live on its own, and it just needs to exist when the container is run. So this is great, I find, for when I need to add maybe like static images, or maybe I'm actually storing a bunch of binary downloads in an image. I've actually seen companies that have done that. Or let's say you have like a Drupal or a WordPress or something, and you need another theme that is in a separate repo that you don't control, and you don't need to do anything with the theme. You just need it injected as files, and it needs to be there. Yeah, the only thing it needs to be is just those files in that directory, and the directory didn't exist before. And so there's no effects.
if you use this command, you really need to make sure that not it's not dependent on order. It's
Yeah.
idempotent, correct?
Yep. Exactly. Dan's actually correct. Docker run progress plain helps. That's what I was going to. That's what I was going to run earlier. But now that we have that build view in the Docker desktop, we don't. I don't have to do the plain. But yeah, dash dash progress plain gets rid of the fancy Docker build kit stuff and just shows you the traditional. It puts everything on screen and it's very easy for seeing exactly what happens there.
Yeah.
We should just show there. Yeah, so this is good for like when you're using CI or something that doesn't have a shell on the screen. So what's happening in this file is I'm creating an image I'm using an Alpine image. I'm copying in files that are essentially images from my file system, and then I'm starting with a fresh new image, not based on my previous stage, but a brand new image, and then I'm adding curl into that image, and then I'm copying in the files from stage one. So it's a little bit of a contrived example.
But that can be, you're telling it that it can run that in parallel with the run command, because we're saying we take responsibility and say line 16 will not affect line 19.
Right. And another advantage of this is that if this is the only line that needs to change, let's say that the static file's changed. Right. If the only thing is that it needs to copy in these new files and it has the dash dash link, then it technically doesn't even need any other layers on your system. So it won't even pull the Alpine image. It won't even pull the previous layers, because the only thing it needs to do is make a new layer and then push it up to a registry if that's what you want to do. Like if you're doing a build with BuildX, you can actually build and push and all in one go. And so it's one of those things where I had a company where they were literally creating a web app in Go, and the only purpose of that web app was to download binaries. I think it was actually downloading like huge tarballs, and it was meant to they were creating an image. I didn't suggest that they do this. They just did it. They create this huge multi-gig image, and the only thing in it is a very tiny Go program that needs to be built and tested, and then this giant image, this giant copy, and that was an excellent example of this, because I wouldn't want it to load the image with that giant 1 gig file that it has to copy in, just because a Golang program that's going to serve the file, which doesn't care what the files are, if the Go program needs to be recompiled or rebuilt because it's a new feature or something, I want those to be separate activities. And usually in the past, what you'd have to do is some trickery where you'd have to make like a scratch stage and then copy it in the scratch stage and then copy that. You did a bunch of weird things.
You have to,
and now you don't have to.
Bespoke craft and trick the system into making sure that it wasn't going to trigger the full thing, full build. That's a really interesting feature, and I think we answered questions about that earlier in our previous show. Someone was asking about like those embedding like big data files, right? Like database files or images or something like that. And the best practice would be to not have that in the Docker image and pull that from some kind of object store.
Pull it down at runtime. Yeah.
Yes. But I understand like sometimes that's not possible. And so this copy link is an interesting way to make sure that there's separations of concerns and you're doing your Docker builds more efficiently.
All right. Docker, we're over time.
2:10.
We're over time. So the last quick example, and this is an easy one because this one should be more understandable. It is a little wordy, but I'm just putting in some text here. The other example that I'll give real quick is this one's from the latest 1.6. So this is actually a really new feature.
That was released, let me see, it was June 2023. So about 6 months ago.
Yeah. And so on this one, what I'm doing is we have this brand new option in the add and the copy commands. Well, specifically, this one's actually is for add commands. Now I think about it, it's not for copy, because add is getting cool again. Add is sexy again. I'm announcing it now. It's bringing sexy back. So we used to for years. Add was around at the beginning, and then copy started getting more focused on just copying files from my local system. Don't do anything with them. Just copy them in. Don't perform anything else, just a strict copy command. Because add had all these weird effects where if you added a tarball, it might unpack it. If you added a zip, it might unzip it. If you pulled it from the internet, which add can do, you can actually put in a URL to add. Add might do something with that as well. It was a little weird. What it was Docker kept adding cool new features to add, but those features had effects, and people were like, I really just want to copy files from my hard drive.
Yeah,
so
and there were sessions at DockerCons about add versus copy around these.
So for the longest time, you're right. So for the longest time, most of the time I'd see an add command, I'd tell people to make it a copy command. Because if it could be done with copy, you should always use copy, because a copy doesn't have these ill effects or unintended consequences. So going back to add had limited uses. Most of us were, at the time before this 1.6 was released last year, the only time I would recommend add is if you were downloading a file from the internet and you didn't want to do that, and you wanted to do that in the build. You actually wanted to download a file that wasn't in the repo. That's why you used it. Kind
of like what we were just talking about. Ish.
With the link. It had those ill effects of always causing the cache to bust, but then the -- link solves that. But yeah, you're right. Like, that's really all we were doing it for. And again, I would use add, and a great example is downloading a theme for a blog engine. And the theme is made by someone else. You don't control it. It's a separate repo. But then you would the problem is add didn't speak Git specifically. So you would have to download the .zip file or the
you have to go to like the raw link, right? Like the raw format of that file in GitHub
you had to be kind of
or whatever.
You kind of had to figure out GitHub. Like, you had to kind of sort of reverse engineer, how does this file get from GitHub? And you'd use the GitHub content.com URL or whatever. Exactly. So what this does is for years, if people needed to clone a repo, what I would see them do is we would do a large run command that we probably could use the here docs. This is where they all start to come together. And that command would include things like, let's install curl or wget, and then and then we have to install git, and then we would maybe either copy down a file and then untar it, assuming that tar or zip or even in the thing. So you might have to install those as well. Right. Or if it's a git, if you're doing a git clone, you would have to install the git command, git clone. And then, of course, you want to clean up. So then you would go and remove the git command or remove the curl or wget. Because if you've ever looked at curl's a hot mess of binding. Like, curl puts stuff all over your system when you install it. It's got tons of things. LDAP extensions, like weird stuff that no one ever needs. So you do that, and it's like 5 lines, right? At least, minimum.
Right.
Well, you don't need that anymore. So at least if it's a git. So add downloads and unpacks, but now we have this git.
So that's awesome. But Brett, we're just talking about 5 lines. Like, why does that matter?
Well, you even need more than those 5 lines, because usually you want to download the Git repo, but you probably only want a depth of 1, which is the latest commit. You don't want every commit,
right? And
you probably don't want the .git directory. So even if you do something like --depth equals 1 in a git clone command, in case you Git gurus out there, if you were to do that, you still probably want to delete the .git directory to clean up, and then you want to get rid of git the command line. So you don't need any of those. You just now need this. And this will even do private. This is the other thing you're probably leading me to, is that it will not just do public. Now, and you can even say keep the Git directory. The only time you'd ever do this keeping the Git directory thing is if you're literally going to develop inside this container and you want to make like commits and stuff. So I would normally not have that in there, but I just showed it as an example. So I'm downloading the buildkit repo into this directory in a one-liner. The other example is I'm using the git SSH syntax instead of just the HTTP URL. I can also use git syntax, and I can include my keys. So the last example we'll do before we wrap this up is the last command here, v1.6. If I'm in this directory and I do a docker build, it's going to fail because it doesn't have my SSH keys, right? Well, I don't have to do any fancy mounting of like SSH key or the agent or anything like that. All I have to do is use my default SSH profile, technically using the SSH agent. And now that one-liner will use my local keys. Yeah, it mounts
Ah,
them. It mounts them. It doesn't
mounts.
copy them in, but I think it technically mounts the. You can use file base, but it mounts by default. It mounts the SSH agent socket, and so it just pulled a
Very
private
cool.
repo, removed the .git directory, so it's nice and clean, just my latest commit, and it's not requiring me to install and remove the Git CLI, so I don't even need it. All in
That's
one
a
line.
and I was also alluding to, like, okay, we've removed five, six, seven instructions, big whoop. But when you're using a CI system and you're doing tens, hundreds of builds a day, those 5, 6 lines add up. That's processing time you're paying for somewhere, right? And that
Yeah,
stuff adds up quick. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but just even going down to one line makes you're saving like a good chunk of money in some kind of
yeah,
way somewhere.
yeah. I mean, some of these like they're neat tricks, and some of them I feel like are game changers. and that's why I try to make these examples. The other example that I didn't have time for today, but is where we actually can mount SSH keys or local files into the build for access to them directly within the build, but they're not actually copied in the image. So that's often used for secrets, for SSH keys, for maybe if you need files that are there temporarily, but you never wanted to have them in the image to begin with. Because back in the day when I would do that kind of thing before we had this mount option, and that was an early feature. That was in 1.2 release. Often you would see people using stages to get around this. They would do some
Yeah.
trickery where they'd copy things into an empty directory on a different image, and then they that way they didn't have to delete things later. And a lot of it we can simplify it. So I've often in the past invited those fine guest people that are here in chat to submit their own Docker files for review, and that we would review them on this show.
Okay.
We're not going to do that today. We
No,
don't
we're
have any
not.
time today, but we do have.
But that might be another might be a future show.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do, and this is a teaser. So if you jump on the newsletter, Brett.news, let me just copy that to everyone. So if you're interested in getting a Docker file, it can be anonymous if you want it to be anonymous, or not anonymous, but a Docker file reviewed on a future episode. Jump on my newsletter, because I'm just trying to think of the only way I know how to tell you. Jump on my newsletter, and we already have a form that you can submit, a type form, and you can submit the information. And then on a future show, we just pick some of the best examples, and then and then of course those people that are in there, we'll let them know. We've done this before. I think we've had it like 2 or 3 episodes, but those are years ago. So a lot of these new features have come out. We need some new examples. Dan is in the chat asking, is there an awesome Docker examples website like Docker Compose? No, there should be. I don't know of one. The best thing
There
I can
might be
tell you
some.
for this, yeah, there might be some I don't know about. If someone in chat knows, please let us know. But if we go back over to release notes for these versions, what you'll read when a lot of that times there'll be links that will take you to the Dockerfile reference, and the Dockerfile reference is up to date, right? Like this whole giant, huge page of content about every feature. Like when I go to copy, you will see it mention. Let's see if we find one here.
The most referenced
Here we go.
Docker doc by a
Yes,
long shot,
ever.
I would imagine.
Look, it says add in and Docker file. Like you probably didn't know what that meant before. Now you do.
Now
Now
you
you do,
do.
internet.
So that's a great way to wrap that up. Thank you for teaching me something new. All of us
Yeah.
had no idea. So something to look out there for if you're getting errors in your Docker builds. It might be this. It might be the Dockerfile front end spec and or version. And thanks for letting us know about this thing that it seems like kind of overlooked for a long time, but it's been there. It's
At
been
least
there
a
for a
little bit of a
while.
mystery. At least a little bit of a
Yes.
mystery. Yeah.
So find us
Thank you.
on
Thank you.
find us here every Thursday, right here on this live show. Come again. We'll have some new topics lined up, guests, all that kind of stuff for 2024. Super exciting. Sign up for the newsletter, Bret.news, and our Discord, right? No, I always get that wrong. Right up there. There we go. You do it slow. Yeah, that's a good idea. And then the last thing is, so I'm in North Carolina in the Triangle area, Raleigh Durham area, and I'm also been an organizer for the DevOps Days conference that we host in the Triangle every year. It's this year on what was it again? It's April 10th and 11th in the McKinnon Center in. Yep, thank you, Bret, in Raleigh, and I have a special discount code for y'all. Um, if you're in the area and you're interested in going to the conference, you'll meet me plus a bunch of awesome speakers. We just did the speaker selection. So if you are in the area or interested in joining us for that conference, there's the discount code. It gets you a few bucks off the registration. So come hang out. You'll see me there, and we'll see you next week, right, Bret?
Yes. Yes, we'll be back. We'll be back.
Yes.
I wish I could be there. I actually think I'm going to be in Paris prepping for KubeCon that week, but
this is April, so I
April, not March. Oh, okay. So
I hope you're. I mean, you might be still in Paris, but which is speaking of which, both Bret and I we're going to be at KubeCon EU. So I've got a talk at the observability co-located event, Observability Day there. So you'll see if you're at KubeCon EU in March, come say hello. We'll likely do a live show there. We're still figuring it out.
Yeah,
but,
we're going to try hard. I mean, internet gods have to, bless us. Like, we were in Chicago. They had cell phone tower things in the building, so we had amazing like gigabit speed. So it was great.
Yeah.
But who knows about Paris? I hear they got good internets over there. So we'll see.
Yep. So see you next week.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.